Okay, perfect. Okay, do you have a notification that says Yuri's recording the call?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, fantastic. All right, well then, okay, perfect. Here it goes. Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another edition of 1+1, your place for inconvenient truth-telling and myth-busting. And my guest today is Clau O'Brien, or Claudia O'Brien Moscoso. Oh, yes, I got that correct.
Moscoso.
Moscoso, okay. Clau O'Brien Moscoso, a Peruvian-American indie journalist, anti-imperialist, and leftist activist. She is a member of Black Alliance for Peace, and she has recently become a sought-out voice on Peruvian topics. And on this episode, in this episode, All Things Latin America episode, we'll be discussing the history of Peru, the recent Western-backed right-wing coup against yet another democratically elected left-wing reformist government, and the reign of terror that's being unleashed. But we're also going to talk about the courageous mobilization against the right-wing terrorists. So do enjoy. And again, I also encourage people to actually check out the playlist of All Things Latin America, which is all past episodes of other guests on 1+1 talking about this, as well as other interesting videos. And of course, please share widely, leave comments, and all that stuff. So first of all, Clau, thank you so much for coming. Thank you so much for coming on the program, especially on the Sunday.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's a real honor to have you, and so the first question I wanted to ask you about about Peru. We will talk about recent current events, but like anything, we have to really get back into the roots because just like when the Ukraine war happened, people think that like history started with Russia's invasion. No, it's a long historical process how we got into the mess that we're in. So in order to talk about Peru and any Latin American country, talk to us a bit about Spanish colonialism and how it evolved from that to the U.S.-led colonialism in Peru, where much of the problems, when we talk about Peru, whether it's racial capitalism, plutocracy, oligarchies, and constant Western imperialism, a lot of that is rooted in Spanish colonialism. So, so talk to us about what the conditions were in Peru when Spain, was colonizing the country.
Yeah. So. The Inca civilization, the pre-Spanish colonization civilization there had been around for thousands of years. I think even maybe over 10,000 years, actually. And so Spain came to our shores in the 1500s, colonized, not just Peru, but the entire area at the Tahuantinsuyo, which is what the pre-Hispanic colonization empire was called. Wasn't just Peru, modern day Peru, right? It was the Altiplano, which considered Bolivia, Colombia, Ecuador. So it was a very giant civilization. Actually, the Spaniards never got to Machu Picchu, which was the historical capital of Tahuantinsuyo. They never actually made it to the actual mountains. They made it to the city of Machu Picchu, but not to the actual mountains of Machu Picchu. So that's why you could still see today that it's one of the seven wonders of the world, and it's been untouched by Spanish colonization.
Interesting.
Yeah. So, but of course, obviously, that was the only part just about that was untouched by it. So you see the Spanish colonization very much today in just the amount of racism that is evident, not just, in everyday interactions with Indigenous folks, particularly from outside of the city, outside of Lima. But with these mobilizations right now, the majority of people that are coming out, especially in the South and outside of the city, are Indigenous, whether Andean or Amazonian communities. A lot of the actually even the petroleum company that last year there was a spill due to I believe it was a tornado or I mean the Pacific Ocean is so linked, right? But something happened in Indonesia. I think it was or a volcano eruption that then caused a spill on off the shores of Peru, mostly the northern shores, that have completely devastated, local fishermen communities in the area. I mean, to this day, there's been no cleanup. It's just been literally citizens coming together to clean it up. But the oil company, Repsol, is a Spanish oil company. So you see this like still lingering, like corporations enacting this colonial mentality of we are literally extracting all your resources, not just physical petroleum, but lives, literally the lives of communities, fishermen communities in the area that still have no way of being in that industry anymore because it's still there. Like I said, there's been no actual cleanup, and since the dictatorship, this company has been forgiven any of the fines that they were even initially fined with. Now they don't even have to pay that.
Wait, you're talking about the recent coup government. So the recent coup government has said to these rapacious mining companies, all sins are forgiven.
All sins are forgiven, exactly. And it's not just them, right? There's so many different mining companies throughout Peru, the majority of which are Canadian mining companies, that are both illegally mining, but also even if it's not illegally, they have the permits or the grants, what have you, still not at all engaging with the local community or even so much as having environmental devastation studies done beforehand. I think it was maybe 2 weeks ago at this point now, the de facto Minister of Energy, Oscar Vera, had greenlit the extraction, the exploitation in Macusani in the southern department of Puno for lithium extraction. And also that said that the grants, the application process would go from 4 years to 6 months, right? So they're just greenlighting all of the exploitation of these resources. And, the people that are on the ground today, much like they were 500 years ago, have said that this is a struggle, still a struggle against the European, and in this point, North American, and not just in the US, but Canada as well, exploitation of our resources, of our lands, pillaging of our oceans, everything, right? And that the people on the ground don't see any of these benefits, right? Peru has some of the largest mineral reserves in multiple things, copper, if not the largest, among the largest, copper, gold, now in Macusani in the southern state of Puno, lithium, so many different, the petroleum from the Amazon, so many different resources that theoretically the people of Peru we should have all of the social services. We should have, free public healthcare, public education, infrastructure at the very least. A lot of what is happening now with the torrential downpours, because it's hurricane season, there have been, especially in the north and coastal north, there have been a lot of huaicos, which are mudslides, because of this torrential downpour. All of these things that, if there even were a modicum of urban or civilian planning, would be enough to have, things to have drainage and everything, but that's not even the case, right? We see areas where kids have to walk 2 hours to get to their schools, and so a lot of the ways that the people on the ground say that this is continuing a 500-year struggle is because the centralized government, or the government here, has been so centralized that it really just functions for a few economic elites, economic and political elites in Lima, while forgetting the vast majority of the Peruvian masses, most of which are indigenous or come from indigenous backgrounds.
So, before we talk about, the period of, the Cold War, or when, the U.S. started to, meddle in Peruvian affairs, it sounds to me as if call it racial capitalism, call it racial capitalism, call it a plutocracy. But it sounds to me as if very much like that kind of, apartheid that's towards, indigenous people, that is still very much ongoing, as well as just like,
Absolutely.
as well as the fact that like the distribution of wealth is only in the hands of a very, very tiny elites, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. And that very tiny elite almost predominantly is European descended, Spanish descended, what have you, right? So it's a very stark contrast to who they supposedly represent to the rest of the country, right? The rest of the country is indigenous, or like I said, have indigenous heritage, but are mixed. Whereas the political and economic elite tend to be European, white Peruvians, or in the case of Keiko Fujimori, Japanese descended, but very much part of the political elite that sells, the internal right wing that sells themselves to those transnational companies, right? So that even if they themselves, some of the Congress members in the right-wing Congress, in the right-wing party, Fuerza Popular, are themselves, Afro-descended. But, they are also part of the misleadership class, Black misleadership class in that case, where they are selling out the interests of the vast masses of the Peruvian population, right? The majority of people that, don't have connections to these Western companies or Western interests, really.
And just before we talk about the Cold War in Peru in the 90s, because just out of curiosity, as somebody who covers a lot of Canadian topics, and I know that Canada has a very rapacious mining industry. Is one of the brutal mining companies that's that's doing all this environmental terrorism and also environmental apartheid and whatnot, is one of those companies, just out of curiosity, are they, is it Barrick Gold, by any chance?
I'm not sure. I know the largest one, I believe, is Plateau, which is owned by American Lithium. But I'm sure there's just so many Canadian companies. I wouldn't be surprised. The minister, I believe it was to the UN, or the U.S. ambassador. I'm sorry, the Canadian ambassador to Peru and Bolivia met with the de facto minister of energies like the day before the coup, something like that. So I'm sure they were talking about the interests of these mining companies specifically in this coup. They make it very obvious, like the U.S. ambassador met with Dina Boluarte a couple days beforehand. It's just very, very obvious who's running the show behind the curtains. And when I touched down on January 3rd, the day before the general strike started, and people were already out in the street, but they had formally called for a general strike starting January 4th. I wasn't sure necessarily what to expect. I hadn't, as an adult, I hadn't really been back to Peru to organize. I was mostly going back to visit family and reconnecting with my roots. But so I wasn't sure, where folks were at, but just very, very clear. Everyone was like, yep, the U.S. is behind this. Lisa Kennedy, they were very on point, like they want the lithium, they want the copper, they want the gold. So they, people know what time it is, and are understanding, the who the players are, who the enemies are, and who the, vendepatrias are. And so that, that's definitely like the local elite, the ruling class. We have a very, we're, talking about the Cold War, super anti-communist, right wing, very, very like fascistic for sure. I mean, it's not even like sugarcoating it. They're absolute fascists.
Yeah, so Peru during the Cold War, did Peru have like with Cobra Benz, of Guatemala, Salvador Allende in Chile, and of course the various João Goulart's of Brazil, was Peru also like did they have like a very modest like left, modest. Okay, but was it another one of those stories where you had very much like a left wing, a democratically elected socialist leader who was going to do the much needed reforms, the much needed restructuring, and basically like work for the benefit of the people, and then the U.S. And its allies overthrew this government. Talk about that and the reign of terror that was unleashed on the Peruvian people. When that happened.
Yeah. So we had like you said, a left wing government in Velasco in the 60s, 70s, and the Constitution of 79, the Peruvian Constitution of 79, which many people on the ground are calling for, we're calling for a constituent assembly for a new constitution. But in the meantime, going back to the 79 constitution, because the 93 constitution was rammed through under the Fujimori dictatorship, which by law privatizes everything, right? So at least the 79 constitution has propositions in, or amendments in it for state companies and some more state control over different industries, over the major sections of the of society. So in the 80s and 90s, there was an internal, up to 2000, really 80s to 2000, there was an internal armed conflict, which maybe not so internal if we understand the history of the Plan Condor and U.S. interference in the region, right? So there were the Sendero Luminoso, which was a Maoist group, and the leader of this was Abimael Guzman, who actually a couple of years ago passed away in jail, in prison. And I mean, during this time, during the Alan Garcia government as well, there was, mass disappearances, massacres, constant massacres, to this day, people, we are finding, mass graves of students, of left-wing organization leaders, just literally anyone, journalists, what have you. So there were massive human rights violations, and in the 90s, Fujimori was elected, and then declared himself, or declared that he was going to dissolve Congress and all other organs of the government. So he
wait. So
installed himself as dictator.
Actually, before we get to Fujimori, so there was a democratically elected leader. The U.S. and its allies overthrow it. There was, Peru had a typical right-wing junta, which not only terrorized its people, but in their constitution basically legalize that. I mean, kind of like in the U.S., corporations are people. So they kind of did like a similar thing where corporations had a lot of power. But then how did they transition from a right-wing junta to a democracy, which later paves the way for an Alberto Fujimori?
I mean, there was definitely a movement, of mass organizations. There was a definitely huge peace movement, right? That wasn't that was both against what was happening, Sendero Luminoso, but then also the junta. So it was very. I mean, even the second transition to democracy after Fujimori was just like mass movements that eventually called for new elections. But even in those new elections, right, there was right wing or liberals that ended up, winning. But then, the interests were still very much corporate power, serving those transnational corporations. And there's just been multiple. So I think, what was it, the last 7 years, we've pretty much had 7 presidents in the past 7 years. There's been very little, there's just been no democracy, really. The Congress is controlled by the hard right-wing party of Fuerza Popular and other parties that are satellite parties, basically, that have managed to maintain. So in 93, like I was saying before, there was the Fujimori Constitution. Even though in 2000 Fujimori was actually deposed and quote unquote we got democracy, we won our democracy back, that constitution to this day remains, which is what is really fueling the coup itself, actually, because a lot of the contracts are up at the end of this year, which Castillo was, even if not fully under state control, wanted to have more say, for the state to have more say, not just all of these resources being privatized, and legally privatized, selling off our assets to whatever private corporation is the highest bidder, or sometimes no bid contracts, right? So it's been a false transition, if that makes sense, right? So okay. There's an air of democracy, but the basis for this exploitation remains, right? So that's been one of the main calls for of people on the ground now is for a constituent assembly to have those fundamental changes that Peruvian society has been calling for decades for, right? But have not been able to actually fulfill these promises because of this constitution, and also because there's I think what a lot of people on the ground were saying when I was there for a few months was that people on the ground should have been more organized, right? And so that's good to see that is actually happening now, where there's actual organization of mass movements and not just dispersed, siloed movements. So it is really great to see what a lot of people are saying there. The Andinos, Andeans, and Peruvians in general have woken up, right? So we understand that it's more than just being able to vote someone in once every 4 years or what have you, or 5 years, but that actually that deep democratic values come from everyday engagement, from knowing from the grassroots level what the needs of the population are, and then moving forward on that, right? So I think that's a positive, but of course it comes at a great cost because there's been so many deaths so far. Right, the numbers are different depending on what human rights organization you ask, but it's at least in the 70s or 80s, or some say even above that, right? And the majority of deaths have been in the southern regions, and southern Andean regions, which are almost entirely indigenous, either Quechua, Aymara, or some Amazonian communities as well. Yeah.
Unbelievable. And before I ask about Shining Path, let's talk. Let's talk just a little bit more about Alberto, Fujimori, and talk about the shocking election and later his right-wing state terror and how his legacy and that of his descendants and far-right parties still plays a huge dominant role. A huge dominant role and a very reactionary role in Peruvian affairs. I mean, you already did talk about that, but I just find it quite fascinating that that Peru is just getting over, the trauma of this Western-backed, dictatorship during, the Cold War, and then all of a sudden, you can have a guy like Fujimori who can just come in and then just, give the next stage of just, like right-wing terror and whatnot.
Yeah, I mean, so there was a consecutive, like, right-wing governments that came in, and I think a lot of that is because they were, able to say that there was a lot of terrorism in the country, which is really where this anti-communism comes from, right? Because of Sendero Luminoso, they were able to, the governments, right, and the state was able to link communism with terrorism, and so it's just, I think, a large part of what explains why Peruvian society is so anti-communist. And even the left wing, shies away from those labels. They don't necessarily shy away from socialists, but that's it. Or even that, right? Yeah, even that is, crossing some lines sometimes. But so they were really able to use that, and the first foreign minister for the Castillo administration was Héctor Béjar, who had paved the way for a lot of the normalization with Venezuela, but then had to quickly leave the administration, step down from the administration, because he had said, I don't know if it was a debate or something, I'm forgetting exactly where, but he had talked about how the Sendero Luminoso had also been funded by the CIA, and that even were getting armaments from Fujimori, and the next day was forced to step down, right? So we see that a lot. Yeah. So with, much like the US does a lot of stuff, they are funding both sides to keep up the pretense of, this problem is happening,
Well, it's funny because I was gonna ask, were a lot of these, terrorist attacks or and kidnappings that were going on, is there any evidence that it was the right-wing Peruvian deep state that was actually engaging in all of that, and then later leaking to the press that it was such and such a terrorist group, such and such a Marxist-Leninist terrorist group, and then of course with corporate media and state-run media, which is in the hands of of these far right-wingers, that is why you have people who, even if they are left-leaning, they engage in that self-red baiting of I'm a socialist, but not like Fidel Castro. Yes, I believe in socialism, but not like those people of FARC and Shining Path who we're going to talk about in a bit.
yeah, pretty much. Yes, that's I feel that's definitely the case. I feel like a lot of the left in Peru is still traumatized from that. I'm not just the left, but Peruvian society in general is traumatized from that. But that's absolutely where you see a lot of that in Peru for sure.
And that's why, and you believe that's why Fujimori managed to, well, that's just one aspect of how he managed to basically get into power then.
Yeah. I mean, using the specter of terrorism, right? Which is not uncommon in what we see around the world, that the right wing does this, right? It uses the specter of whatever it is, but terrorism, left wing, what have you, right? They always prop up a boogeyman. And I mean, Fujimori served in time for two massacres in Barrios Altos and La Cantuta, which had there is evidence that he paid right wing gangs to carry out these massacres. Not I mean, there are so many other massacres, but those are the only ones that he's actually serving time for, and other human rights abuses.
And he was and didn't he also engage in like the forced sterilization of indigenous indigenous people, particularly those that live in the remote parts, like in the mountainous parts of the country.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So they were right. They mostly they mostly operated exactly in the in the highlands regions. But like I was saying before, a lot of the organizing that was going around, that was happening against the violence, both of the state and the Shining Path, and at some point became very much just paramilitary groups and violence that was really targeting indigenous communities. I mean, there it would only be majority be indigenous communities. So there was a lot of organizing and just, people trying to, create self-defense committees, such things like this, and just general like peace organizations. Actually still are around today, some like human rights orgs that are still around. But I mean, yeah, the right wing was able to use this specter to get power and maintain power and like have a very strong hold over power. And to this day that we see that, Fujimori's daughter, Keiko Fujimori, was the candidate that Castillo went against. And she's been a candidate multiple times actually, and has lost multiple times. But still we see Fuerza Popular being able to use this lawfare to basically have parliamentary coups to get these more left-wing governments and presidents out and install their own dictator, puppet government, transitional governments, as they say. But they're denying early elections. They voted for the elections to be sometime in April of next year, but that will be after the contract laws are up, which is why most Peruvians on the ground are saying for immediate elections. Actually, one of the biggest demands is the restitution of Pedro Castille, because the impeachment was done illegally. So there's a international case going on right now with the Inter-American courts, or at least the lawyers, Castillo's lawyers, are trying to bring it to that. But they have, legally speaking, even under the 19th Constitution, a basis for which to say that this impeachment was done illegally and that actually Castillo is still the democratically elected president.
Unbelievable. Well, I have a few more questions, but you actually have to get going. So this is what we're going into. We're going to stop the recording right now. I'm not going to upload this to YouTube just yet.
Okay.
And we'll try to we'll try to get you on soon. Then we can record like part 2, and then I can merge them.
Perfect.
And I can merge them together. So we were joined on this edition of 1+1 with Clau O'Brien. Join us for part 2, coming to you in a YouTube near you very soon. Yep. Okay. Does it say that Yuri's recording the call?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Well, hello everyone. Welcome to part 2 of 1+1, all things Latin America, all things Peru, with my guest Claudia O'Brien Moscoso, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, frequent contributor to Black Agenda Reports and a member of Black Alliance for Peace. And yes, and this is part 2 of our discussion on all things Peru. So first of all, Clau, thank you for coming back on the program.
Sure, thank you. Thank you for having me.
It's an honor to have you, and yeah, let's get into it. So before we talk about Shining Path, I just wanted a very quick follow-up question about Alberto Fujimori, because he's clearly of a Japanese background, but did his family background, did it have any links to Japanese fascism and post-World War II Japanese far-right movements by any chance?
So there have been speculations about concerning that, but as far as I know, I haven't seen any like concrete evidence. But of course, that wouldn't surprise me if fascism runs in the family. But yeah, as far as I know, I haven't actually seen any concrete evidence pointing to that. I think his parents, like most Japanese immigrants to Peru, were poor and landed in Peru in the coast to work as like fishermen, or very, very poor immigrants. And then I think his family, obviously they like scaled up in the economic ladder or whatever. They had I think his dad had like a car repair shop, something like that, in Lima. And they grew up in
why did he become such a huge right-wing asshole then?
Yeah.
Jesus.
Yeah. At that time, I think so. He was they migrated in the 30s, right? And then actually during, I think they lost their shop during World War II, and Peru was actually deporting Japanese people to the U.S. to go to the internment camps. So I think they actually did lose the family business or whatever. Yeah.
Wow,
Yeah.
that's a very sad chapter then in Peruvian history, and I know in Brazil, Japanese immigrants also faced a lot of
Yeah.
racist backlash when
Yeah.
Brazil formally joined, the alliance. But
Yeah.
that being said, it's sad that that Fujimori went in a
Yeah.
yeah, far right, direction. But then, well, all right. Well, thanks for that. But then, when we last talked, we were just beginning to talk about the Marxist armed rebellion group that came out in Peru during the late 80s, but throughout the 90s, which was Shining Path. So
Mhm.
explain to our audience briefly, if it's even possible, explain to our audience the Marxist Armed Rebellion Group, a Shining Path, and what was their depiction in corporate state media, both in Peru and internationally, and in the NGO world, and what were the half truths leveled against them. So for example, like FARC in Colombia and the IRA in Northern Ireland, were they guilty sometimes of the human rights violation or horrific attacks that they did unleash on people, which only caused the public to be more supportive of the reactionary state that ironically they were trying to overthrow. Talk to us about Shining Path.
No, exactly. That's exactly what happened. So they really started in the 70s, I believe, but really came to fruition in the 80s.
Okay.
So the leader, or the person that started, is Abimael Usman, who a couple years ago actually passed away in prison. And so he had gone to China during the Cultural Revolution, was like, oh my God, this is what we need to do. Back home, came back to Peru, and really the main hubs started in Ayacucho, and in the Andean highlands. And obviously the reason for that being that the Peruvian state, having been so centralized since Spanish conquest, never there, and it's still the case today, that there was never really any development outside of Lima, right? So like to today, there's really no public infrastructure, basic things, right? So it's very easy for any Marxist organization, or really any organization for the people, to be like, this is not okay, these conditions are not okay, and we should take up arms to rectify the situation. And I think at first many of the peasants that were on board were very much on board, right? Throughout the years, though, they're much like you were saying, right, with the FARC or the IRA, they were responsible for a lot of the human rights abuses. They turned against other sectors of the left, labor leaders, like community organizations. They murdered Maria Moyeno, very famous Afro-Peruvian peace activist, really. A lot of the organizations that came up around that time were very much, not to sound like a liberal, but like against the Peruvian state, which did commit many of the massacres, right? And against Shining Path, that they saw were maybe initially pro, the campesinos, indigenous folks, and then saw them turn against, their family members, what have you, very, very violent things. But I think a lot of the, in the media, both in Peru and outside, it was the Shining Path that was responsible for absolutely every, human rights atrocities that happened. The internal armed conflict really was from like the 80s to 2000. It was a 20-year armed conflict. There were several other armed groups that were also around at the time, the MRTA, Tupac Amaru.
Other left-wing, other armed left-wing groups.
Yeah, but they also had, splits between themselves. And so some of the fighting was actually amongst each other. I think I had mentioned this last time, but when Héctor Bejar, who was Castillo's first foreign minister, he was very much responsive. He was leftist, Marxist, is a Marxist, and he was responsible for the reestablishment of ties with Venezuela, many different things, foreign policies, progressive foreign policies that Castillo initiated. And there was one time that he actually was speaking about the Shining Path in terms of, this saying that they actually did get funding from the CIA to turn their war against the state against other sectors of the left. And then the next day he had to step down. He was forced to resign. And so that has not, there hasn't been necessarily any concrete evidence to that. And I think that's also like a debated. Even within the Shining Path, there's like several splinter groups that came from that, from Shining Path that also refute that. But yeah, so it's in Peruvian memory, they're just very much I think a huge part of why there's anti-communism in Peruvian society, of course, is just because they see that the representation of that was the shining Sendero Luminoso, and there was so many, is what you would say, contradictions, right? That left many thousands, tens of thousands of people dead, and other allegations of rape and torture, things like this. So yeah, I think that legacy continues to today. I think that there are still not armed, they're not engaging in armed struggle, but there are, as what they say, it's obviously the state, so who knows, right? But they do say that there's still some pockets that are still active. But I think it's now more trying to be in the electoral sphere, which
kind of like what FARC is doing, but then
right.
but then the half truths. So some of the atrocities that they did commit, some of the human rights abuses that they did commit. I mean, yes, it's true, but also when we talk about Peruvian politics, or when we talk about lots of Latin American politics, which is always in the hands of, a reactionary oligarch, far-right parties, we always have to be very careful about, okay, where does the truth start, but then full-on propaganda, begin, because of the fact that the state is mostly guilty of most of the human rights abuses that take place. But before we get to the current crisis that is happening before we get to the current crisis that's happening in Peru right now, briefly then, if it's possible, let's talk about the period of Peru when a center-left or left-leaning, government was elected under the leadership of Alejandro Toledo, who I believe was the first leader, and I would guess left-leaning one, from an indigenous background that was elected in Peru. What's your assessment of him? And what's your assessment of him and his legacy?
Yeah. So Toledo, he comes to power he gets elected after 2000, which is when Fujimori finally steps down, says there's going to be new elections, and then he's not going to run. This actually comes after, hundreds of thousands of people were in the streets to topple the dictatorship. So Toledo runs as you said, the first indigenous president. He was always calling himself the Cholo from Harvard, right? Because I think I don't think he actually studied in Harvard, but he did teach there, if I'm not mistaken. I think he actually studied in California, Stanford, and another school I can't remember. But
Interesting.
yeah, but prior to that, he also worked at the World Bank, Inter-American Development Bank, and a couple other ones, right? So, you know, he might have said culturally or socially some leftish, you know, somewhat progressive things, but through and through, he was always a neoliberal. His period of governance saw a lot of new, like, free trade agreements with the U.S., with a bunch of different countries, actually. If you, so the period of his administration was, it did see like a rise out of poverty, pretty significant, actually. But of course, that was never really towards the most impoverished, right? It wasn't in the Andean highlands. It was very much, you know, still centered in Lima. But even still, right, there's very, very poor people in Lima that also never saw those like free trade agreement, you know, boom in the economy. And now he's actually back in Peru. He was extradited on corruption charges. He had been in, I think, Miami under house arrest for some time. And I mean, this is true for like pretty much, I think, the last 6 of our presidents are now, yeah.
Go ahead.
The Odebrecht trial and the Odebrecht scandal stemming from Brazil. I think that his corruption charges are based around trying to build a highway from Brazil to Peru. And you know, with the Odebrecht trial, there's apparently like a whole bribery department. He's accused of having stolen $35 million US dollars and taken a bunch of other bribes. So now he's also in the Penal Barbadillo, along with Alberto Fujimori, who's serving time for the massacres in La Cantuta and Barrios Altos, and also Pedro Castille, who I think he's the only one of the presidents that hasn't been charged with corruption charges, and the charges that he has been, you know, like rebellion and sedition there's just no evidence, right? It's very, very lackluster. Actually, his impeachment didn't even follow the constitutional law. So you'd have to get 104 votes for an impeachment. They only got to 101 votes, but still did everything, you know, a couple other stipulations that have to happen. So
Toledo, so Toledo was definitely no friend to the mass to the mass working class, right. But still, and many people I would say many people overlooked some of the red flags, like him, like his Harvard background, or even him working for the World Bank. A lot of people, I assume, overlooked that background because they thought, well, come on, an indigenous person, come on, he's running for he's running with like a left-wing party.
Yeah,
it's got to be, you know, better than the right-wing the right-wing reign of terror of Fujimori, right?
Absolutely, yeah. And they saw, you know, I think again, because of this legacy of terrorism that many Peruvians just saw, like, this is what communism is. They didn't necessarily overlook those things. They were like, oh, okay, this is gonna get us out, right? So coming out of the Fujimori reign of terror, people weren't like, okay, we're like socialists and we, you know, I think people in the highlands, in the most forgotten provinces and regions of Peru, they also, and to today, right, they don't say that they're socialists, they don't say that they're, you know, neoliberals or anything like that. They I mean, what they say is actually, you know, like nationalizing industrialization within Peru to benefit the people of those areas. This is what we would, you know, consider socialism anyway, right? But they don't necessarily say that, and I guess, and I do think it's because just there's so much history of anti-communism that a lot of the rhetoric just, it gets, you know, people don't necessarily think, don't necessarily want to, you know, align themselves with any like left-wing, you know, really any socialist or Marxist or communist
That's I find that quite striking because I think, those of us who do study Latin American politics, I think, when we do think of who are the most Americanized of the of the region of Latin America, Mexico comes to mind, Brazil, Chile, and Colombia. I think those four, those are the ones we think like those are the ones where like were the U.S. and the capitalist class of those countries have been the most successful at making those places the most hostile towards any form of leftism, whether it's moderate leftism of an AMLO or or socialism of a Hugo Chavez, a Maduro, which really does try to confront the system head on, and of course, far leftism, Marxist Leninism or any kind of communism. But I had no idea though that there should be a fifth country within those four, which is yours truly, Peru.
Yeah, no, absolutely, truly. I would say that, and especially again, like in Lima, the U.S. is number one. Everyone strives to be, the American, to have that American dream, even if they don't necessarily migrate to the U.S., right? But it's very much seen as like, this is how you like move up in life, right? So that has been like an internal colonization of the mind, right? From all of this time, even before Fujimori, honestly. But that's definitely still something that I would, I see pretty clearly every time I go back home and visit family, and this time around too. But I think what's really really important is what is happening because right now this movement to overthrow this dictatorship is very much based in the forgotten areas of Peru. It's the leadership is very much coming from Puno, which is the southernmost department in Peru that borders Bolivia. And they're the ones that are saying they're rejecting neoliberalism, the neoliberal dictatorship that started with the Fujimori constitution from '93 that still remains in place, right? So
that Fujimori constitution really gives special incentives of corporations, domestic or international, just free reign to do whatever it wants.
Complete free reign. By law, it privatizes all of our resources. Any contract with a company is actual law, so they call it contratos de ley. So these become laws for the past 30 years, and right now, so at the end of this year is when all of those contract laws are up. All those contracts are up, and Castillo wanted to either make them more under state control, not necessarily fully nationalize them, but at least have the state having more of a say, which is why the coup happened when it happened, because those multinational corporations really want to keep those, the 30-year contract laws.
So when we talk about that's a perfect segue to this question, so let's talk about the current crisis, and let's talk about the current crisis and the rise of the left-wing candidate Pedro Castille, and talk about the constant right-wing sabotage against him, how the coup came about. What's the what the current right-wing dictatorship? Let's be honest about what the current right-wing dictatorship is doing, and just in general, talk about what's been the Peruvian left-wing resistance to it in response to this Western-backed right-wing, coup/terror in Peru right now. Then.
Yeah. So Pedro Castillo is a indigenous person from Cajamarca, one of the northern regions in Peru. Son of illiterate campesinos. He's a teacher, school teacher, and a union leader for the teachers union, and led one of the most successful strikes a few years back of the teachers union. So he comes from, from the places where the people that have been the most forgotten in Peru, in Peruvian society are, right? So a lot of people really, and his main, one of the things that he kept saying throughout his campaign was no more poor people in a rich country, because Peru really has some of the biggest riches, like natural resources in the world, right? Copper, gold, water, literally water, right? The Lake Titicaca. And now lithium in the Puno region specifically, right? And so we know with lithium, such an important resource in the, Green New Deal. But
yeah, exactly.
But that still relies on imperialism and extracting resources, not necessarily caring what that means for the environment. And a lot of folks they're not against extracting resources. What they are against is extracting those resources to foreign companies, and they don't see anything, right?
Exactly.
So owning those resources is really what the campaign was about, and what I think what a lot of people on the ground are really trying to get back is that the popular ownership of what is underneath our lands, right? And using those resources for education, for infrastructure, healthcare, things like this, right? And so Castillo, and in the first round of election, I think he only got 19% of the vote. And so the second round of elections, the runoff was against him and Keiko Fujimori, the daughter of Alberto Fujimori, who actually was also the first lady during his reign.
Fujimori's daughter was the first.
Yeah. She was the first lady after her parents got divorced, because one of the human rights abuses that Alberto Fujimori committed was torturing his wife. Yeah, yes.
Really?
So comes to power.
Jesus, this guy is
after his mother has been tortured and she has nothing to say about it. I think her mom died a few years ago, actually. Yeah, this is the family that mafia family that has been running Peru for the past 30 years. And it's not just them, right? It's all of their like political allies, Montesinos, who was the head of the intelligence service during the Fujimori dictatorship. Even still, William Zapata, who's now one of the prime ministers. The head of the ministers. And so people still say that it's literally the same mafia family that runs the country and has been doing so for forever, right? And even before Castillo, the past 6 presidents have been toppled by the far right Congress that's dominated by Fuerza Popular, which is the Fujimori party. So literally almost every year we've had a different president.
Even when that president does the bidding of
PPK, right? The Pedro Pablo Kuczynski, who's a banker, like complete neoliberal, was just giving away things. Even still, I think in 2018, he was forced to resign, and then Merino came in power, or not Merino, I forget who came after him, but it was literally just like year after year after year. And so we'd see that again with Castillo, right? Like once again, the Congress has violated the popular vote, installed their puppet dictator, who is, the people on the ground see as a traitor, because she was Castillo's vice president, who said multiple times. So this was actually his third impeachment I think it was after his first or second impeachment attempt that didn't go anywhere. She, at a public rally, I think it was in Puno, said that if they try to get rid of Castillo, I will step down, which would force early elections, right? She didn't do that, which is why people, call her usurper and traitor, and obviously a dictator. So as of right now, there have been probably close to, or if not more, 80 deaths, I think over 1,500, wounded, and still many still hospitalized. It's been a massacre, and again, the violence has been concentrated in the Andean highlands of the south. Also along with one of the campaign promises and his administration's promises was constituent assembly, a popular constituent assembly, for us to rewrite the Constitution away from this, dictatorship Constitution from '93. The biggest things being, of course, nationalizing industries. They really, because lithium has not necessarily been extracted yet, or has been industrialized, or has been taken out, literally exported. That is the newer, I guess, industry that Castillo and the administration really wanted to hone in on, and people in Puno specifically really wanted to do. And that's, when he was, I think he's only given one interview since being in prison. And that was the main thing that he was saying, it's the lithium. Yankee imperialism wants the lithium, and that's why they had to take me out. And that's what people on the ground say, right? Like the Western interests, U.S. and Western interests want our resources. They're not, they're not done ransacking our lands, and that's why this is happening. And even if people on the ground aren't necessarily like the biggest Castillo supporters, which many are, because they see themselves in him, they mostly want their vote to be respected, right? And want to see an end to this this Congress that has been, right-wing Congress that has been dominated by our former dictator and by his daughter. And I think she's run maybe like 3 or 4 times and has lost every time, but now finds herself literally, puppet mastering behind Dina Boluarte. So yeah, that's what, people on the ground are saying, that, this is not a democracy. I think the biggest demands are really like having more of a say in political life, right? It's not just about voting every 5 years, and particularly the constituent assemblies where they want to exercise their political power. And what's really exciting is seeing, like I said, that it's the mostly indigenous campesino people that have been in the forgotten Peru, but what they call Peru Profundo, right, the deep Peru, that are the main actors in this protest movement and in this struggle, right? They see this as a struggle against 500 years of colonization, whether it was from the Spanish crown or from the Republic of Peru once it became a republic, right? They see that everything was centralized in Lima, and that everything else was forgotten. So a lot of people really, want to change that and want to really bring forth the sovereignty of Peru, and who are the governed, right? They should be in political power.
A very quick final up question is: do you think what's happening in Peru now? Do you think this is the moment where Peru is finally going to have its sort of Bolivia moment? It's sort of Bolivia, Latin American pink tide swing, and dare I call it revolution? But that Peru finally gets the much needed social, racial justice, pushback against this right-wing terror that's been inflicted on them since Spanish colonization. Do you think like Peru's finally going to have its kind of Evo Morales Bolivia moment in Peru?
Yeah, I do think so. And it's going to be a long ride, and I think people are aware of that. But I do think that this is everything that when I was there for 3 months on the ground, talking to people, everyone said like this was the moment that woke us up, right? Like it's been how many presidents in the past 6 years? Like we just don't have a constitution or democracy. And it's not even about, well, I mean, it is about how presidents get toppled so easily by the right wing, but that their lives have not gotten better, that their kids' lives have not gotten better, that even if people from rural regions end up moving to the city, they face extreme discrimination, racial, just all kinds of like racial and ethnic hatred towards them, their children, right? They don't see that I mean, even when people were coming up from the southern regions to Lima to have like bigger protests, the media was really calling it an invasion of immigrants, even though these people are literally Peruvians, but they don't see these folks as Peruvians. They are, alien othered, right?
Wow.
And so that's what they're fighting for. That's like literally fighting for their dignity. And I do think that this is the moment that, and like I said, it's going to be a very long struggle. But I think that people are there. There have been a lot of exciting developments around organizational developments, literally block by block kind of organizing and these are traditions and long held Andean traditions of, having communal neighborhood discussions, right? That assemblies, popular assemblies. This is, all very traditional for folks there in the Andes, because that's just the way that even pre-Spanish colonization we governed. So a lot of these practices, these actual, pre-Hispanic practices have been coming back. I mean, I guess they were always there, but now our people actually see it. And the idea of it is very much they are seeing Bolivia as quite possibly a template, right? The idea of having a plurinational constitution is very much at the forefront, meaning that, Peru has, I think, over 55 different racial and ethnic groups, the majority being from the Amazon, and that many languages, right? So it really is a nation of many nations, right? And so what does that mean, right? What kind of representation would all of these different nationalities have within a plurinational constitution, let's say? And these are the questions that are starting to, and things that are starting to be debated within the popular councils, right? So one of the first decisions that the Puno's council made was not giving food to cops that were killing them. Literally not selling any produce to military or the police or anything like that. They kind of ran out the state, or the state retreated. Lima Boluarte said that, all the armed forces should leave Puno. Some are still there, but it's very, they kind of did run them out. I think now there's going to be a regional strike on May 30th, and then a macro regional strike a few weeks after that. And then in mid-July, people are going to start traveling back up to Lima for a third takeover of Lima. So recently,
wow.
Yeah.
So I mean, positive developments, like a real resistance is being mobilized, and one could only hope that that they win. So yeah,
absolutely. There's a lot of I feel like there's a lot of hope in the air amidst all the tragedy, amidst all the death. I still think that there's a lot of hope in the air.
Fantastic. And my second to last question is this: we've been talking, about an indigenous-led resistance and an anti-indigenous racism in a country like Peru, where like Bolivia, there's a large indigenous population, which I think to a degree internationally it gets a lot of solidarity. It gets a lot of solidarity internationally with organizations like Black Alliance for Peace and the many Latin American solidarity groups. But you're based in Turtle Island, you're based in, New Jersey, in the United States. And I have to ask this question, which is, when do you think the plight of indigenous people who sadly are a minority within their own country, when do you think that there's going to be more solid, sorry, I'm not speaking clearly today. Yeah, when do you think that the plight of indigenous people and the urgent solidarity they deserve is going to be more, of a big, topic, because in the U.S., there is a big Black left movement, Latinx left movement, eco-socialist, feminist movement, queer left movement, and workers' right movement, and even an anti-imperialist movement. When do you think that those groups are going to show more urgent solidarity to indigenous people in the U.S. mainland, but also Hawaii and Alaska?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I would hope that it would be as soon as possible. Because we see very similar to indigenous struggle here, that there's a lack of infrastructure. There's just a lack of dignity at the base level. There's a lack of dignity for indigenous peoples, both on this side of Abayala, which is considered both North and South America in South America, both in the north and in the south, all throughout Turtle Island, right? And I think that this is. Yeah, I would urge people in any of the left movements that you just said to be in solidarity with the Peruvian struggle right now. That at its core is really an uprising against imperialism and colonization. That it's not just. I mean, it is about restoring democracy, if you want to use liberal terms, but it really is a struggle against this constant colonization and ransacking of our lands and disposal of the predominant indigenous campesino populations that have to suffer, what these foreign mining companies are doing, and previously, obviously, the Spanish Empire was doing, but that hasn't changed, right? I mean, a lot of the companies are whether U.S. or Canadian, or European, right? Like the emperor is not just Spain anymore. It's just become, an alliance of NATO.
Multiple hydras, yeah.
Multiple, exactly. So, and these struggles are connected, right? Peru and Colombia have, those are the two countries that have the Southcom bases. I believe, in Southcom bases, it's 17, and so they're both in Peru and Colombia. I believe the number of U.S. military bases in Peru are 18. So, much like the bases in Hawaii or the bases really anywhere around the world, right? This is the struggle against U.S. Western imperialism and their axis of domination, right? The U.S., EU, NATO axis of domination, as we say in Black Alliance for Peace. That is a struggle, right? And of course, it's a struggle against colonialism at the end of the day,
Exactly. So and so any victory that happens, in Latin America is only half won, and ergo, it means that that the U.S. left has to also step up its efforts in eradicating domestic settler colonialism at home. But we're almost out of time. I don't know if we actually. Well, let's try to do this quickly before you have to rush off. But so we end the program with the questionnaire done by Marcel Proust, later the French broadcaster Bernard Pivot, and then my hero, the late James Lipton of Inside the Actors Studio. Clau, it's your turn to do this before you have to rush off, so let's go. What is your favorite word?
Lately, it's
and it can be Spanish or whatever is the indigenous languages of Peru.
I would say Pachamama, which means Mother Earth in Quechua.
Nice. What's your least favorite words?
Capitalism.
What good one? What turns you on creatively, spiritually, or emotionally?
I think the like organic moments in the struggle, whether it's like going to the beach together with your comrades and like having a beer, or yeah, I think that those moments where you notice the like, oh, it's in a struggle, like I'm fighting for you because we're family.
Fantastic. And then what turns you off?
Being opportunists and being talked down to, kind of like being given orders, right, instead of coming together to create something.
What's your favorite curse word then?
In Spanish would be concha tu madre.
Conchu?
Conche de tu madre.
Okay, I think it's pretty self-explanatory, even for someone like me who doesn't speak Spanish. Then, what sound or noise do you love? Followed by what sound or noise do you hate?
What sound of noise do I love? I birds, just nature. I love hearing nature. I love just being in nature and smoking a joint, And
then, and then, what sound or noise do you dislike then?
Probably like car horns. I really dislike like.
I can imagine there's a lot of that. I can imagine there's a lot of that in New Jersey then, or even in Lima for that matter.
Yeah, exactly. So.
And then what profession, if you weren't doing yours, would you love to do? Followed by what profession would you absolutely not want to do under any circumstances?
What profession would I love to do? That's just, you stumped me on this one. Maybe doing more like human rights law work. That would be interesting. Not necessarily that I feel like human rights framework, legal framework is the best, but I think that you can get more into the weed work of like trying to actually prosecute some of these war criminals.
Exactly. Yeah. And then what profession would you absolutely not want to do under any circumstances?
Probably being a banker or stockbroker or something like that.
And then finally, if heaven exists, what would you like to hear God say as you arrive at the pearly gates, or whatever is your vision or belief in the afterlife? And even if you're an atheist, you can answer this question. Feel free.
Probably, you tried, you did, you tried coming together for your peoples. Good job on the effort. A for effort.
Alrighty. Well, we were joined on this edition of 1+1, our All Things Latin America edition, All Things Peru, with Clau O'Brien, a member of a contributor to Black Agenda Reports and a member of Black Alliance for Peace. Clau, I hope this will be the first of many conversations we have both on the air and off the air. Until then, you have a fantastic weekend, and my very best to the people in Peru, and let's hope that they, power to the people, death to Yankee imperialism, power to the people, death to settler capitalism, and not just in Peru, but also in the United States. So all my best to you.
Yes, thank you so much. Take care.
You're welcome. Thank you.